Good morning. This is Ellen Horseman. I'm with First United Methodist Church in Camden, Arkansas. We have been studying in our Sunday school lessons a book by Bishop Michael Curry called Love is the Way, Holding on to Hope in Troubling Times. This week I'm going to cover both chapters 11 and 12, and that winds this up. Next week I will start a Bible study of the book of Ephesians. But let's get to this week. All through the book, Bishop Curry has been answering questions about love that he has been asked. His question in chapter 11 is, does love mean avoiding politics? Chapter 12, he will kind of pull the whole book together, and he entitles that chapter, which, by the way, has no question, Hope, Help, and Healing. So, does love mean avoiding politics? Of course, I can't help but think of the old saying that the two things that you never talk about are religion and politics. And now we're asking is, if we are Christians and we are engaging in Christ's love, do we need to stay out of politics? Well, there's a good reason for us to ask that question, because nowadays in our country, politics have become so toxic. Not just the politics of political leaders, but the politics of us ordinary mortals who like to get on social media, who like to argue with each other, who sometimes can get upset seemingly over nothing. Bishop Curry said that he too has been very concerned about the soul of America and the soul of Christians, not only in this country but elsewhere, as they become more and more political. He writes in his book, in Christianity, just as in our national politics, the voice of extremists are drowning out the silent majority. And those extremists are using religion to defend a panoply of isms: racism, nationalism, nativism, sexism, and on and on. And as Curry says, he believes that the vast majority of Christians, and for that matter, the vast majority of Americans, don't agree with either of these extremes. But because we tend to be silent, kind of standing back and not wanting to cause trouble, the voices of the extremists are sort of taking over, and it's causing a crisis. Because of that, at one point, I believe he said it was in 2018, he was meeting with another religious leader, and they got to talking about their concerns about America and their concerns about the national discourse. And they decided that they would like to do something that would call people to put the ways of Jesus first, to reject what I call the politics of hate, to reject that kind of dialogue, to reject these isms that I just mentioned. So they decided on a little, I don't know what to call it, initiative that they called Reclaiming Jesus. What they wanted to do was give a message to politicians that there are a lot of Americans, a lot of Christians who don't agree with this politics of hate and attack and division, but also just to take a stand and say, we want the way to be the way of love and the way of Jesus. Well, how could they do that in a way that was non-confrontational? How could they do that in a way that didn't offend one side of the political divide or the other? They decided on a candlelight vigil. And so what they did is in May of 2018, they met in a church in downtown Washington, D.C. They had a little prayer service and some talks and devotionals. And then, and he said it was a large group of people. I didn't think about writing down the number, but quite a bit more than what they had anticipated. But these thousands of people got their candles and then silently walked to the grounds of the White House. They'd already been given permission to come onto the grounds of the White House, so they silently walked down there. The religious leaders who had kind of started this movement took some posters upon which they took their articles of faith, and I'll tell you about those in a minute, and just kind of walked around in a big circle with those articles of faith, nothing being said, people just standing there quietly with their candles. Then they sang a few church hymns and had a prayer and went their way. Sounds like a great thing. But lo and behold, this very call to nonpartisan Christian love ended up creating quite a firestorm. Let me read their principles first, and then I'll talk a little bit more about that. Here's a summary. I actually went to the website and read every word of their faith principles. And when I say a summary, I'm getting the key points as they put them. So here's what they said they believed in. Oh, let me find it. We believe that each person is made in God's image and therefore has a fundamental worth and dignity. We believe that we are one body in Christ. We believe that how we treat the hungry and the thirsty, the naked and the sick, the stranger and the prisoner is how we treat Christ himself. We believe that truth-telling is morally central to our public and private lives. We believe that Christ's way of leadership is servanthood and not domination. We believe that Jesus truly meant it when he told us to go into the whole world and make disciples, because we believe that God so loved the world, the whole world. And so those were their beliefs. And so as a result of those beliefs, as they enumerated, they rejected things like racism and sexism and xenophobic nationalism. They rejected the idea that politicians or leaders would lie or would exploit racial fear or racial hatred. They said, we don't want to see that. They rejected attacks on immigrants. They rejected the harassment and exploitation of women. I don't know, they sound like good things to me. And yet there were people that objected to what these people were doing. Why? Well, I went online and read several articles that were written at the time attacking these people as socialist in religious clothing, as people that somehow were anti-Trump or anti-American. And when I'm reading that, I know we have this tendency to take sides, but I'm thinking as I read it, if this same set of principles, this same declaration of faith had been made by some more conservative evangelical Christians, then they would have agreed to them, because I think they're things that all Christians actually agree about. And then the sad thing is, what might have happened, probably would have happened, is that people that were a little bit more liberal Christians would have attacked the conservatives. What in the world are we doing? We are the body of Christ, and the way of love and the way of Christ should be what rules us. Not our politics, not the way of power, not the way of attacking each other, but the way of love. That's where we should be. So how do we engage in politics, and how do we follow the way of love in both our social life and in our political life? I'm going to find my glasses, here they are, and read to you from a passage in the Gospel of John. Now this comes in the 15th chapter of John. In John's Gospel, gosh, I think it starts about chapter 13 and moves forward. John has a very, very long discussion of the night in the upper room. And so that's where the disciples are now. Jesus has already washed the feet of the disciples. And in chapter 15, the chapter begins with words that will be very familiar if you've heard a lot of Bible studying, where Jesus says, I am the vine and you are the branches. And he talks about how we need to remain in him. Now I want to read just after he said that, he uses the image of the vine and the branches, and this begins in 15:9, because I believe here, as in many other places in the Bible, Jesus and God the Father in other places tell us how we are to engage in our everyday life and how we should engage in our political life. But let Jesus speak, beginning with verse 9. He says, as the Father loved me, I too loved you. Remain in my love. Boy, I'm going to stop right there. Wouldn't life be so much easier if we kept praying and kept doing this? Remain in my love, he says. If you keep my commandments, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and remain in his love. And I'm going to say right now, I didn't know I was going to keep stopping myself, but when he says, keep my commandments, we're not talking about a lot of rules. He'll tell us what that commandment is. But I love this too. He says, I have said these things to you so that my joy will be in you and your joy will be complete. This is my commandment. Love each other just as I have loved you. Do you hear that, brothers and sisters? Jesus wants us to have joy. And how do we have that joy? We keep his commandment, and he tells us that his commandment is that we love each other just as he has loved us. Let him go on. No one has greater love than to give one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. I don't call you servants any longer, because servants don't know what their master is doing. Instead, I call you friends, because everything I heard from my Father I've made known to you. You didn't choose me, but I chose you, and I appointed you so that you could go and produce fruit, so that your fruit could last. As a result, whatever you ask the Father in my name, he will give you. I give you these commandments so that you can love each other. Do we have a question about how we should get along in our political life? Do we have a question about how we should get along at church or how we should get along in our daily life? There's the answer right there from Jesus. Remain in me and love each other as I have loved you. We have to engage in issues. We can't stand on the sideline. That's what I like to do sometimes, is kind of stand on the sideline, because I don't like controversy. And I mean, I like for everybody to agree with me, but otherwise I don't like controversy. I don't like that, the give and take and the hate and all that sort of stuff. So how do we engage in politics? Well, first of all, we need to do so in a way that honors other viewpoints. We need to get past the idea that if someone doesn't agree with us, then they are to be despised. Even stepping outside of Christianity for just a moment and to just talk about America, this country was founded because of compromise. Compromise used to be a good word. Compromise is what made us the strong country we have been and are. And yet we're hung up right now on the whole idea that you don't compromise, that it's all about power, and that you never compromise with the other side. And we've taken that into our Christian life, and we've taken that as Christians into our view of politics. We want to go with the politics of power and of no compromise and of constant confrontation, but we can't do that. And we also can't withdraw and sit on the sidelines and say, forget all you crazy people, because if we do, then we let the extremists take over. So what do we do? The bishop gave a great example of something that was done by religious leaders in North Carolina. They met with the politicians there in North Carolina, and they talked with them. And fortunately, and I think to the credit of those politicians, they were willing to meet with these religious leaders who said to them, look, you are passing legislation that's going to affect humans' lives. So how about if you do this? Try to apply to everything that you do, apply the golden rule. Love each other. Of course, the bishop said if you mention love and politics in the same breath, people look at you like you're crazy. But he asked people, and the other religious leaders with him asked the politicians, try to apply the golden rule. Make that a part of what you do. Now, as they did that, they began to find that they could compromise with each other some. Again, I think that if we start saying, hey, let's apply love to our politics, what if we all wrote to our congressmen and our senators and said, we want you to treat other people as you want to be treated yourself. We want you to apply the golden rule as Jesus tells it to us in Matthew's gospel and in Luke's gospel. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, or treat other people as you want to be treated. We don't think of politics that way. We're more like the Grand Inquisitor in the Russian novelist Dostoevsky's novel, Brothers Karamazov. In this novel, Dostoevsky has the Inquisitor. He meets Jesus. Jesus has come back to earth and he's been brought before the Inquisition, the trial, and the Inquisitor looks at him, figures out who he is, and listen to what he says. Oh, not you again. And he then goes on to declare that Jesus was stupid. that Jesus was stupid to reject Satan's offer. Do you remember when Satan said, if you'll bow down to me, I'll give you all the kingdoms of the world? And what the inquisitor says is, you should have worshiped Satan. Listen to what he says. With ultimate power, think of all the good that you could have done. Power works. Might makes right. All that love and humility and free will for humanity stuff is out, and so are you, Jesus. Now, if you find these words appalling, and you should, remember, it's from a work of fiction, and it's making a point. But if you find these words appalling, then take a look at our politics, and take a look at how we, as church people, and some of our church leaders engage in politics. We have bought in to the same idea that the Grand Inquisitor espouses, to the same idea that we see religious leaders in the Bible following, and that we see going on today. The idea that we need to have might, that we need to have power, that we need to get things our way, and we need to get revenge when we don't. That is not the way of the Christ, and it is not the way of love. And you know what? It doesn't work, does it? Look at the mess we're in right now. In Paul's words, we need to choose the more excellent way. And of course, the more excellent way is love. We can't engage in politics on the terms of politics that we see today. We need to come in to the political arena, and we need to come in to our communities with love being our guide. And love means sacrificing. Love means listening. Love means hearing other people's stories. In North Carolina, as I said, they found when they actually had dialogue, these politicians with religious leaders, and tried to apply the golden rule, they were actually able, people from both sides, liberals and liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans, people who couldn't agree on many things, found a way to compromise on legislation that was helpful to the citizens of North Carolina. What would politics be like? What would politics be like if we applied the golden rule? Treat other people as you want people to treat you. The path to love, my friends, which is the path that we're on, if we're going to remain in Jesus, like he tells us there in John's Gospel, the path to love needs to look like love, because the way of love, or I should say maybe the way to love, is to follow the way of love. So we need to love our neighbor as ourselves. Remember that when Jesus was asked, another take on the great commandment, when Jesus was asked by that lawyer, well, what's the greatest commandment? We know this. He said to love God with all your might and strength and power. I'm paraphrasing, obviously, but love God with all you are. And then what's the other part of it? Love your neighbor as yourself. I'm going to read you, if I can find it here, from Bishop Michael Curry. Sorry about that. He does a really good job of discussing this. So let him have a word here. I think this came from the little devotional and talk that he gave on the night that they marched in their little candlelight service. And he talks about the first commandment is a great commandment, to love God with all your heart and soul and mind. But he says the second one is just like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor. That's why we are here. Love your neighbor. Love your neighbor. Love the neighbor you like, and love the neighbor you don't like. Love the neighbor you agree with, and love the neighbor that you disagree with. Love your Democrat neighbor. Love your Republican neighbor. Love your independent neighbor. Love your black neighbor, and your white neighbor, and your Hispanic neighbor, and your Asian neighbor, and your indigenous neighbor. Love your South American neighbor. Love your LGBTQ neighbor. Love your Jewish neighbor. Love your Muslim neighbor. Love, 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 love your neighbor as yourself. On these two hang all the laws and the prophet. That last line that Curry quotes there, on these two hang all the laws and the prophet, friends, that comes directly from the mouth of Jesus. And what Jesus is telling us is that Everything that we read in the scriptures, everything that we hear from the Spirit of God, all of it hangs on that idea of love, that we love God and that we love our neighbor as ourselves. That is the way to have good political discourse. That is the way to get along with each other. If what we do is not about love, then it's not about God. And I'm saying that now, think of that in terms of politics. How many times in politics does one side or the other, one extreme or the other, claim that it's carrying the mantle of God, it's carrying the mantle of Christianity, and those other people are unchristian or ungodlike? If it's not about love, it is not about God. And if it is about love, then it is about God. It's as simple as that. We need good people to take a stand for love. Because, friends, through love, God truly can make all things new. The bishop has a wonderful story in his chapter 12 about a man who was changed by love. I can't remember now where the bishop said he was, but he was visiting somewhere, a big group of people were there, he had preached or something. And by now he was kind of popular because he had sort of been made famous, at least for a while, after he had preached at the wedding of Harry and Meghan. So a lot of people were wanting to come up afterwards, and a line formed, and they were coming up and getting selfies with him and all smiling and happy to see him. But he noticed one man, a 6-foot-plus white man in the crowd that had a very serious look, almost looked angry. And Curry said he had to admit that it made him a little uncomfortable. Remember, Curry's an African-American man. He's had some experiences that weren't so great. And he worried about this man, and what was this man, why was he in line, and what was he going to say? Well, when the man came up, he really surprised Curry, which shows what happens when we jump to conclusions, by reaching out his hand and saying to the bishop, "I am so glad that you are our bishop." And then he proceeded to tell him a little bit about his story. This man had been raised in a family where both his father, his grandfather, his brothers, everybody in the family, were members of the KKK. He had been raised in an atmosphere of racial hatred and racial tension. And to his credit, as he grew up, he began to realize that that was not the way to live. But he was so ashamed of where he came from, ashamed that he, for a while, had embraced those KKK views, ashamed of who he was. And it happened that he moved somewhere in Arkansas, and he wandered into an Episcopal church. It was not the church in which he was raised. But the people were very nice to him, and so he kept going to church there, and little by little he got to know the people there. And finally he told Bishop Curry he felt like he had to tell these people where he had come from. He had to tell these people about his shameful past, which this shameful past of being a member of the Ku Klux Klan, of being from people of that type, it was a painful embarrassment to him. But he finally told it to the people. And he looked Curry in the eye, and with tears in his eyes, he said to Bishop Curry, "And they loved me anyway. They loved me anyway." These people in this little church somewhere in Arkansas had taught this man about unconditional love. And they had helped him to experience the forgiving love of Jesus Christ. I can't think of a better legacy than that, can you? That is what love can do for us. Unconditional love. Love, God's love, has the power to change the world if we'll just believe that the way to engage in politics, the way to engage with each other, the way to engage on social media is the way of love that puts God and God's love above everything, and that loves our neighbor as ourselves, or as Jesus says in the Golden Rule, that treats other people as we would want to be treated. Sometimes I get a little frustrated. Well, not sometimes. I often get frustrated with what I see going on. Frustrated with what seems to be the continuing politics of hate and animosity that Americans have towards each other. But I love the way the bishop ends his book telling us not to give up on love. And I'm going to find my way and flip to it, excuse me, just one little minute here. Okay, here we go. So I'm going to use his words to finish our lesson for us. So listen to the bishop here. And I hope you've enjoyed this Sunday school series, and I look forward to starting a look at Ephesians with you. But let the bishop have the last word on God's love for us and on how we can live out the wonderful self-giving agape love that God has given to us. He says, the world changes for the better one life at a time. So don't give up on love. Listen to it. Trust it. Give into it. Obey it. Love can help and heal when nothing else can. Love can lift up and liberate when nothing else will. May God love you and bless you. And may God hold us all in those almighty hands of love. That's where we're going to end it, friends. May God hold you in his almighty hands of love as you share that beautiful love with other people. Amen, and God bless you all.